The music had not even finished when Margaret grabbed Alina's wrist and pulled her behind a marble pillar, her eyes shining with a dare she had been holding back all evening. Charlotte and Beatrice followed close behind, fans pressed to their lips to hide their smiles. Across the crowded ballroom, seated alone in a chair no one else dared approach, was the Duke of Ashford Blackwood, a man whose cold stare had ended more than one hopeful debutante's evening in tears. "Go and sit beside him," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling with excitement rather than fear. "Sit right there next to the Duke and stay for a full 5 minutes. If you do it, we will never call you plain again." Alina felt her heart drop into her stomach. She had heard the same stories everyone in London repeated behind gloved hands. The Duke had not danced in 3 years. He had not smiled at a single lady since his return from the war. Hostesses arranged entire seating charts around the single rule of leaving an empty chair beside him, because the last woman who tried to speak to him had been met with a silence so complete that she left the ballroom in tears before the second course was served. "You cannot be serious," Alina said, though she already knew her sisters were. "We are completely serious," Beatrice said, tilting her head toward the Duke's still figure, "unless you are too frightened." That single word, frightened, struck something old and tired inside Alina. She was 22 years old and had spent every ball of her life standing in the shadow of her sisters, watching them collect compliments and dance partners while she was left to hold their shawls and listen to their complaints. She was clever. She knew she was clever, but cleverness had never once been enough to earn her a place at the center of a room. Tonight, for reasons she could not fully explain even to herself, she decided she was done being afraid. "Watch me," she said, and before her sisters could respond, she stepped out from behind the pillar and began walking across the ballroom floor. The room did not fall silent immediately. The orchestra kept playing, and couples kept turning in slow circles beneath the candlelight. But as Alina moved closer to the empty chair beside the Duke, heads began to turn one by one, like dominoes falling in a long and curious line. A woman near the refreshment table stopped mid-sentence. A gentleman lowered his glass without drinking from it. By the time Alina reached the chair, the music seemed to fade into the background of her own pounding heartbeat, and the entire ballroom had gone quiet enough that she could hear her own slippers against the polished floor. The Duke did not look up. He sat with his shoulders straight and his jaw set, staring at some point across the room that no one else could see. His dark coat was perfectly tailored, his cravat crisp and unwrinkled, and his hands rested on his knees with the stillness of a man carved from stone. Alina had seen him from a distance many times before, at church, at the theater, once even at her own family's dinner table when he had come to discuss a matter of business with her father, and left within 20 minutes without touching his tea. But she had never been this close to him, close enough to see the faint scar above his left eyebrow and the tired lines that had settled around his eyes far too early for a man of only 30 years. She lowered herself into the chair beside him. For a long moment, nothing happened. Alina kept her hands folded neatly in her lap and stared straight ahead, counting the seconds in her head the way her sisters had instructed her, refusing to look at the man beside her even though every part of her wanted to know what expression had crossed his face. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her back. Somewhere behind her, she was certain her sisters were watching with a mixture of glee and disbelief, already imagining how they would describe this moment to their friends over breakfast tomorrow. 1 minute passed, then 2. The Duke still had not spoken. He still had not moved. Alina began to wonder if perhaps this would be the entire dare. 5 minutes of silence beside a man who did not even know she existed, and she would return to her sisters having accomplished nothing more than proving she was brave enough to sit in an uncomfortable chair. Then, without warning, he turned his head. Alina felt the shift before she saw it, a change in the air beside her, and when she finally allowed herself to glance in his direction, she found the Duke studying her with an expression she had not expected. It was not anger. It was not the icy dismissal she had braced herself for. It was something closer to confusion, as though she had said something puzzling even though she had not spoken a single word. "You are not supposed to be sitting there," he said finally. His voice was low and even, carrying none of the sharpness the rumors had led her to expect. "I am aware of that, Your Grace," Alina replied, keeping her tone as steady as she could manage. "I was told the chair was empty, and I happened to need somewhere to sit." A flicker of something crossed his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Every hostess in London leaves that chair empty on purpose. You must know that." "I had heard something to that effect," Alina admitted, and to her own surprise she felt a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I confess I have never understood why an empty chair should be treated with such reverence. It seemed a shame to let it go to waste." For a moment the Duke said nothing at all. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes moving over her face as though he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces did not quite fit together. Alina held his gaze and refused to look away, though her pulse was racing faster than she cared to admit. Then something happened that no one in the ballroom expected, least of all Alina herself. The corner of the Duke's mouth lifted, just slightly, just enough to be called the beginning of a smile. "What is your name?" he asked. "Alina Whitmore," she answered. "Alina Whitmore," he repeated, as though testing the sound of it. "I do not believe we have been properly introduced, Miss Whitmore, though I recall dining with your father some months ago." "You did, Your Grace. You left before dessert." This time the smile reached his eyes, and a quiet laugh escaped him, so brief and unexpected that a nearby couple actually turned their heads in disbelief. Alina heard a gasp somewhere behind her, followed by hurried whispers, and she understood in that moment that whatever was happening between her and the Duke was no longer a private matter. The entire ballroom had noticed. The entire ballroom would be talking about it before the night was over. "Forgive me," the Duke said, composing himself, though the trace of amusement remained in his eyes. "I was not aware the soup course held such personal offense for you." "It did not," Alina said. "I simply thought someone ought to mention it since no one else seemed willing." "And why is that, do you suppose?" Alina considered the question carefully before answering, aware that his eyes had not left her face. "I imagine most people are too frightened of you to say anything at all, Your Grace. They would rather leave an empty chair beside you than risk a single word of honest conversation." The words hung in the air between them, bold enough that Alina half expected him to rise from his seat and walk away without another word, the way the stories claimed he always did. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair and regarded her with an expression that looked almost like respect. "And you are not frightened," he said. "It was not quite a question." "I was," Alina admitted honestly. "Considerably so, in fact, right up until the moment I sat down." "And now?" She thought about it for a moment, aware of her sisters still watching from across the room, aware of the whispers spreading through the crowd like a fire catching dry grass, aware that her entire life had somehow narrowed down to this single conversation with a man she had been told to fear. "Now I find myself rather curious," she said, "as to why a man who can laugh so easily has spent 3 years pretending he cannot." The Duke went very still. For a moment, Alina feared she had gone too far, that she had reached past the boundary of polite curiosity into something too personal, too raw for a first conversation in a crowded ballroom. She saw something shift behind his eyes, a shadow passing over features that had only just begun to soften, and she prepared herself for the cold dismissal she had been warned about. But it did not come. Instead, the Duke studied her for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier lightness, replaced by something quieter and more careful. "That is not a question anyone has asked me in a very long time, Miss Whitmore. Perhaps that is precisely why no one has received an honest answer," Alina said gently. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked out across the ballroom, at the swirl of silk gowns and polished boots moving in time with the orchestra, at the hundreds of eyes that were, even now, doing their best to appear as though they were not staring directly at the two of them. Alina watched him carefully, wondering what memory or thought had pulled his attention away, wondering what weight sat behind those tired eyes that had learned to hide behind cold silence. Then the music shifted, the orchestra beginning a new and gentler piece, and the Duke turned back to her with an expression Alina had not yet seen on his face, something open and searching that made her breath catch in her throat. "Miss Whitmore," he said, rising from his chair and extending his hand toward her with a formality that somehow felt entirely new, as though he were performing an action he had forgotten he still knew how to perform. "Would you do me the honor of the next dance?" A murmur swept through the ballroom loud enough that Alina could hear it even over the opening notes of the music. She glanced toward her sisters and found all three of them frozen in place, their fans lowered, their earlier smiles replaced by expressions of pure astonishment. This was not what any of them had expected. This was not supposed to happen. The dare had been a joke, a cruel little game meant to embarrass her, and instead the entire ballroom was watching the feared Duke of Ashford Blackwood ask the overlooked middle daughter of the Whitmore family to dance, for the first time in 3 long years. Alina looked up at his outstretched hand, at the quiet hope she could now see plainly in his eyes, and she felt something settle inside her chest, a warmth she did not yet have a name for. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, placing her hand in his. "I would like that very much." As he led her onto the floor, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath around them, Alina understood that whatever had begun in that empty chair was only the very first step of something far larger, something that would soon reach far beyond the walls of this ballroom, and change the course of her life in ways she could not yet begin to imagine. By the time Alina and her sisters returned home that night, the story had already begun to travel faster than any carriage could carry it. A servant girl who worked 2 houses down had heard the tale from a footman who had been standing near the refreshment table, and by morning, 3 separate notes had arrived at the Whitmore residence, each one asking, in careful and polite language, whether it was true that the Duke of Ashford Blackwood had danced with Alina Whitmore for the first time in 3 years. Alina sat at the breakfast table turning a piece of toast over in her hands, not eating it, while her mother read the notes aloud with growing excitement in her voice. Her father, usually a quiet man who preferred his newspaper to conversation, lowered the paper just enough to look at his middle daughter with something like surprise. "The Duke danced with you," he said, as though saying it aloud might make it more believable. "He did," Alina said simply. "Twice," Charlotte added from across the table, her voice tight in a way that Alina recognized immediately. Charlotte did not sound impressed. She sounded unsettled, the way she always sounded when something did not go according to her plans. The dare had been meant to embarrass Alina, to give her sisters something to laugh about for weeks. Instead, it had turned into the very thing that none of them had prepared for, an actual connection, witnessed by half of London's most influential families, between the quiet middle daughter and the one man in the entire city no one had managed to draw out of his silence. Margaret, to her credit, seemed genuinely pleased for her sister, at least at first. She squeezed Alina's hand under the table and whispered that she always knew there was more to her than people gave her credit for. But Beatrice and Charlotte exchanged a look that Alina had seen many times before. A silent conversation passed between 2 sisters who had spent their entire lives believing that attention, admiration, and good fortune belonged to them by right, and to no one else. Over the following days, the attention only grew. Alina received an invitation to tea from a woman she had never spoken to before, a wealthy widow with a reputation for gathering the most interesting gossip in the city. She received compliments from gentlemen who, only weeks earlier, would not have known her name. And on the 4th day after the ball, a carriage bearing the Blackwood crest arrived outside the Whitmore home, carrying a letter addressed directly to Alina. She opened it in the privacy of her room, her hands trembling slightly as she broke the seal. The letter was short, written in a firm and careful hand, asking whether she might join the Duke for a walk in the gardens near his estate the following afternoon, should her family permit it. There was nothing improper in the request, nothing that could be read as anything other than a gentleman's polite invitation, but Alina found herself smiling as she read it, aware that something had shifted in the world in a way she had not fully expected. Her mother, upon hearing the news, nearly wept with joy. Her father gave his permission without hesitation, though he warned Alina, in his quiet way, not to allow herself to be carried away by attention that might prove temporary. Alina promised she would be careful, though privately she was not entirely certain the warning applied to her feelings at all. It was the Duke who seemed to be the one taking a risk, stepping so publicly out of the silence he had guarded for years. The walk in the gardens became the first of several. Over the following 2 weeks, the Duke called on Alina with a regularity that surprised everyone who had known him before, including, it seemed, himself. He arrived with small gifts that were never extravagant but always thoughtful, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, a sketch he had made of a bird they had once discussed during one of their walks. He asked about her opinions on matters most gentlemen never bothered to raise with young ladies, questions about philosophy, about the state of the country, about what she believed made a life worth living. Alina found herself answering honestly, without the careful performance she had always been taught to display in front of eligible bachelors, and the Duke seemed to appreciate her honesty more with each visit. Slowly, in fragments offered during quiet moments between longer conversations, Alina began to understand why he had withdrawn from society in the first place. He spoke, briefly and with visible effort, of the war, of friends who had not returned home, of a betrothal that had ended not long after his return, when the woman he had once loved decided she could not bear the changes she saw in him. He never spoke of these things at length, and Alina never pressed him to say more than he was ready to share, but each small piece he offered felt like a gift more precious than any book or sketch. "You are the first person in a very long time who has not asked me to be the man I was before the war," he told her one afternoon, as they walked slowly along a path lined with early spring flowers. "Everyone else seems to want that man back. You seem content to know the man standing in front of you now." Alina considered his words carefully before answering. "I never knew the man you were before, Your Grace. I have no reason to miss him. I find the man standing in front of me quite interesting enough." He laughed then, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and Alina felt a small thrill of pride at having caused it. Not everyone in London shared Alina's growing happiness, however. As the weeks passed and the Duke's attentions toward her became impossible to ignore, whispers began to circulate that were far less kind than the excited gossip of the first few days. Some of these whispers, Alina suspected, had not begun on their own. It started with small comments, dropped carelessly into conversation at gatherings Alina attended. A lady mentioned, apparently in passing, that she had heard Alina was rather too forward for a young woman of good breeding, sitting beside a man she had not been introduced to and speaking to him without any proper hesitation. Another remarked that it seemed rather convenient that Alina, the least remarkable of the Whitmore sisters, had somehow managed to capture the attention of the most eligible bachelor in the city, and wondered aloud whether there might be some scheme behind it. Alina did her best to ignore these comments, but they grew more frequent, more pointed, until she began to suspect that someone close to her was feeding these small poisons into the ears of London society. She had no proof, only a feeling that settled uneasily in her chest each time she caught Charlotte's eyes lingering on her a moment too long, or noticed Beatrice's smile grow just slightly too tight whenever the Duke's name was mentioned at dinner. The Duke, for his part, seemed unbothered by the whispers, at least outwardly. When a distant acquaintance made a thinly veiled remark about Alina's supposed ambitions during a dinner party they both attended, the Duke responded with a firmness that silenced the entire table, defending Alina's character without hesitation and making it clear, in no uncertain terms, that he would not tolerate such comments in his presence again. Alina felt a rush of gratitude toward him in that moment, though she also noticed, with a small ache of worry, the way his mother watched the exchange from across the table with an expression that was difficult to read. The Dowager Duchess, Constance Blackwood, had said very little to Alina during their few encounters, offering only polite and carefully measured words that gave nothing away of her true feelings. But Alina had heard, through the same channels of gossip that carried every piece of news through London society, that the Dowager Duchess had long hoped her son would marry Lady Cassandra Fenwick, the daughter of an old and influential family whose estate bordered the Blackwood lands. Lady Cassandra was beautiful, accomplished, and perfectly suited, in the eyes of society, for a man of the Duke's position. She was also, Alina gathered, quite aware of the growing attention between Alina and the Duke, and not at all pleased by it. At a garden party held in early summer, Alina found herself face to face with Lady Cassandra for the first time. The other woman was every bit as elegant as the rumors suggested, dressed in a gown of pale blue silk that caught the sunlight beautifully, her golden hair arranged in perfect curls beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Miss Whitmore," Lady Cassandra said, her voice smooth and pleasant, though her eyes held something sharper beneath the polite smile. "I have heard so much about you. It seems the entire city speaks of nothing else these days." "I hope they have not exaggerated too greatly," Alina replied carefully. "Oh, I am certain the stories are quite accurate," Lady Cassandra said, her smile never wavering. "Though I confess I find it curious. The Duke and I have known one another since childhood. Our families have long expected that our futures would be joined together. It must be rather strange for you, stepping into a story that began so long before you arrived." The words were delivered with such gentle courtesy that Alina almost missed the warning hidden inside them. Almost. She held Lady Cassandra's gaze steadily, refusing to let the other woman see how deeply the comment had landed. "I was not aware any promises had been made between you and His Grace," Alina said. "No formal promises," Lady Cassandra agreed, tilting her head slightly. "But expectations can sometimes carry as much weight as promises, Miss Whitmore. I only hope, for your own sake, that you understand what you may be walking into." Before Alina could respond, the Duke himself appeared at her side, greeting Lady Cassandra with polite but distant courtesy before turning his full attention to Alina, his expression softening in a way that seemed to speak volumes without a single word. Lady Cassandra excused herself gracefully, though Alina caught the brief flash of frustration that crossed her face before she turned away, and Alina understood, with a growing sense of unease, that the path ahead of her would not be a simple one. That evening, back home, Alina found Charlotte waiting in her room, sitting on the edge of the bed with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic. "You should be careful," Charlotte said, without any of her usual sharpness. "People are saying things, Alina, not just about you and the Duke, about your character. I would hate for you to be hurt by all of this." Alina studied her sister carefully, searching for any sign of the resentment she had grown used to sensing beneath Charlotte's words. She found none, only what appeared to be genuine concern, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe that perhaps her sister's feelings toward her had truly softened. "Thank you for the warning," Alina said quietly. "I will be careful." She did not yet know how much reason she would soon have to remember those words. Summer settled over London with warm afternoons and long evenings, and with it came an invitation that surprised the entire Whitmore household. The Duke requested that Alina join his family for a private dinner at Blackwood Hall, an invitation that signaled, to anyone paying attention, a seriousness of intention that went far beyond garden walks and ballroom dances. Alina's mother spent 3 full days selecting the perfect gown, while her father quietly reminded her once again not to lose herself in a happiness that might yet prove fragile. Alina arrived at Blackwood Hall with her heart racing, though she did her best to appear composed as a footman led her through halls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and into a drawing room where the Duke stood waiting near the fireplace, looking every bit as nervous as she felt. He crossed the room to greet her personally, taking her hand and holding it a moment longer than strict propriety required, before leading her toward his mother, who sat in a high-backed chair near the window. The Dowager Duchess greeted Alina with the same careful politeness she had shown before, offering compliments on her gown and asking measured questions about her family, her interests, her opinions on matters of art and literature. Alina answered each question thoughtfully, aware that she was being studied and evaluated in ways that went far beyond simple conversation. By the end of the evening, she could not tell whether she had earned the Dowager Duchess's approval or merely her tolerance, though the Duke squeezed her hand gently as he walked her to her carriage, and told her, in a low voice meant only for her ears, that his mother rarely spoke so freely with anyone she had only just met. "She asked about my father's business dealings," Alina said, still uncertain what to make of the evening, "and whether I had ever traveled outside of England." "She is trying to understand you," the Duke said. "That is more than she has done for anyone else I have brought before her." "Anyone else?" Alina asked, unable to keep the curiosity from her voice. The Duke smiled, though something more serious flickered behind his eyes. "There has been no one else, Alina, not in this way, not since before the war." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formality of a title, and the sound of it, spoken so gently, settled warmly in her chest for the entire carriage ride home. But even as their connection deepened, the whispers surrounding Alina grew sharper and more frequent. What had begun as gentle curiosity had shifted, over the following weeks, into something closer to outright suspicion. At a musical evening hosted by one of her mother's oldest friends, Alina overheard two women discussing her in hushed but audible tones, wondering aloud whether the Whitmore family had perhaps arranged the entire courtship through some clever scheme, whether Alina's father had made promises or offered incentives to secure his daughter's rise in society. Alina tried to dismiss these comments as the ordinary cruelty of a society that thrived on gossip, but the pattern of the rumors troubled her. They were too specific, too consistently aimed at the same doubts, always circling back to questions of her sincerity, her motives, whether she truly cared for the Duke or simply for the position he could offer her. It felt, increasingly, less like the natural chatter of curious strangers and more like something carefully planted and carefully tended. She began to pay closer attention to her own household, watching for any sign of who might be behind the whispers. Margaret remained warm and supportive, genuinely delighted by her sister's happiness, offering encouragement whenever Alina returned from an evening with the Duke looking anxious about the latest round of gossip. Charlotte continued her strange mixture of concern and distance, warning Alina to be careful while never quite explaining what exactly she should be careful of. It was Beatrice, however, whose behavior troubled Alina most. Beatrice had always been the most competitive of the three sisters, the one who measured her own worth by comparison, who had once wept for an entire afternoon after Margaret received more compliments than she did at a small family gathering. Since the night of the ball, Beatrice had grown quieter, more watchful, spending long hours away from the house on errands she never fully explained. Alina noticed her slipping notes to a young maid who worked in a household connected to the Fenwick family, though when Alina asked about it directly, Beatrice simply laughed and claimed she was arranging a surprise for their mother's upcoming birthday. Alina wanted to believe her. She wanted more than anything to believe that her own sister would not act against her happiness so deliberately, but the uneasy feeling remained, settling deeper into her chest with each new whisper that reached her ears. The situation grew more complicated still when Lady Cassandra Fenwick began appearing at nearly every event Alina attended, always positioned somewhere nearby, always offering comments delivered with such practiced sweetness that only Alina seemed to notice the sharp edges hidden beneath them. At a garden party held to celebrate the start of the summer season, Lady Cassandra approached Alina directly, her smile as polished as ever. "I understand you dined at Blackwood Hall," she said, her tone light and conversational, as though discussing nothing more significant than the weather. "How lovely for you. I have dined there so many times myself over the years that I have quite lost count. The Dowager Duchess and my mother are the closest of friends, you understand. We have always assumed that our families would one day be joined together properly." "His Grace makes his own decisions," Alina replied evenly, refusing to let the comment shake her composure. "Of course he does," Lady Cassandra agreed, though something in her eyes suggested she did not entirely believe her own words. Though decisions made in the warmth of a new attraction are not always the same decisions a man makes once that warmth has cooled. "I have known Ashford since we were children, Miss Whitmore. I have seen him at his very worst, in ways I doubt you have yet witnessed. Attraction is easy. Understanding takes years." Alina held her ground, though the words lingered with her long after the conversation ended, planting small seeds of doubt she had not asked for and did not want. She found herself wondering, in quiet moments alone, whether Lady Cassandra was right, whether the connection she shared with the Duke was built on something as fragile as newness and excitement, destined to fade once the initial thrill had worn away. These doubts might have remained private, small worries she kept to herself, had it not been for what happened at the end of that same week. Alina had written the Duke a letter, a simple and heartfelt note thanking him for an afternoon they had spent together walking through a nearby park, discussing everything from poetry to the future of the country, laughing more freely than either of them had in years. She had entrusted the letter to a household servant to deliver to Blackwood Hall, as she had done several times before without incident. 3 days passed without any response from the Duke, which struck Alina as unusual, given his habit of replying promptly to her every letter. She told herself there might be a simple explanation: business matters requiring his attention, an illness in the household, some ordinary delay that had nothing to do with her. But when a full week passed with no word at all, and the Duke failed to call on her as he had promised he would, Alina's quiet worry sharpened into genuine alarm. She finally encountered him again at a charity function held to benefit a local hospital, an event neither of them could have avoided without drawing significant attention. When their eyes met across the crowded room, Alina expected to see the warmth that had become so familiar over the past months. Instead, she found something guarded and distant, an expression that reminded her painfully of the cold stranger she had first approached at that fateful ball. She crossed the room toward him, ignoring the whispers that immediately began to circulate around her, and found him standing near a window, his posture rigid, his eyes carefully avoiding hers even as she came to stand beside him. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I have not heard from you in some time. I hope nothing is wrong." He turned to look at her then, and Alina saw, with a growing sense of dread, that something had indeed changed. The warmth she had grown accustomed to had been replaced by a careful, measured distance, the same distance he must have shown to everyone before she had somehow broken through it. "I received your letter," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Then why did you not respond?" He hesitated, studying her face as though searching for something, some sign of deception he expected to find but could not quite locate. "Perhaps you should tell me, Miss Whitmore, why your letter contained words I do not believe you would have written." Alina felt a cold shock move through her entire body. "I do not understand what you mean." "The letter I received," he said, his voice tightening, "spoke of my title, my estate, the comfort and position that marriage to me would provide. It spoke very little of anything else. It was not the letter of a woman who cares for the man behind the title. It was the letter of a woman calculating her own advancement." "I never wrote such words," Alina said, her voice rising with genuine alarm. "Your Grace, I promise you, whatever letter you received, it was not the letter I sent." He studied her for a long moment, and for one hopeful heartbeat, Alina believed he might simply accept her word, might trust the honesty they had built together over the past months, rather than the mysterious contents of a letter she had never written in such a manner. But something had shifted in him, some old wound reopened by whatever words he believed she had written, and the careful trust between them had already begun to crack. "I would like to believe you," he said quietly, "but I have been deceived before, Miss Whitmore, by someone I trusted completely. I do not know if I have the strength to survive being deceived again." He excused himself before she could respond, leaving her standing alone near the window, the noise of the charity function suddenly deafening around her, as she tried to understand how a letter she had written with such genuine affection could have arrived in his hands transformed into something calculating and cold. Walking home that evening, replaying every word of their conversation, Alina's mind returned again and again to the servant who had carried her letter, to the household maid Beatrice had been meeting so secretively, to the sharp watchfulness that had crept into her sister's eyes since the night of the ball. A terrible suspicion began to form, one she desperately hoped was wrong, but which refused to leave her thoughts no matter how hard she tried to push it away. Someone had rewritten her words. Someone had taken the honest affection she had poured onto that page and twisted it into something ugly enough to drive the Duke away. And as much as it broke her heart to consider it, Alina could think of only one person close enough to her household, and desperate enough for reasons of her own, to have carried out such a scheme. Alina did not sleep that night. She sat by her window long after the rest of the household had gone quiet, turning the terrible suspicion over and over in her mind, searching for any reason to believe she was wrong. Beatrice was her sister. They had shared a nursery as children, had whispered secrets to one another beneath blankets during thunderstorms, had comforted each other through their mother's frequent disappointments and their father's long silences. It seemed impossible that the same sister who had once wiped tears from Alina's face after a childhood fall could now be capable of such a deliberate cruelty. And yet, the pieces fit together with an uncomfortable precision. The secretive meetings with the Fenwick household maid, the way Beatrice's mood had shifted from resentment to something almost triumphant over the past week. The timing of it all, arriving so precisely at the moment when Alina's connection with the Duke had grown strong enough to threaten whatever arrangement Beatrice believed she was protecting, or perhaps whatever reward she had been promised for her interference. Alina confronted her sister the following morning, finding Beatrice alone in the small sitting room they had once shared as children, arranging flowers in a vase with a calm that struck Alina as almost cruel given what she suspected. "I need to ask you something," Alina said, closing the door behind her, "and I need you to be honest with me." Beatrice did not look up from the flowers. "You look tired, Alina. Perhaps you should rest." "Did you take my letter to the Duke, the one I wrote him last week?" Beatrice's hand stilled for just a moment, so briefly that Alina might have missed it had she not been watching so closely. Then she resumed arranging the flowers, her expression carefully neutral. "Why would I do such a thing?" "That is what I am asking you," Alina said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain calm. "The Duke received a letter he claims came from me, filled with words about his title and his estate, words I never wrote. Someone changed what I said, Beatrice. Someone rewrote my letter and sent it to him in my place." "And you believe that someone was me?" Beatrice finally looked up, her eyes bright with an emotion Alina could not quite name, something between defiance and desperation. "Why would I care so much about your little romance that I would go to such lengths to destroy it?" "I do not know," Alina admitted honestly. "That is what I do not understand. We have never been close, not the way I am with Margaret, but I never believed you hated me enough to hurt me this way." Something in Beatrice's composure cracked at those words. She set down the flowers with hands that were no longer entirely steady, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a bitterness Alina had never heard from her before. "You have no idea what it is like," Beatrice said. To spend your entire life being told you are the beautiful one, the accomplished one, the daughter who will surely make the finest match, and then to watch every single season pass without a single serious offer, while you, the quiet one, the one no one ever noticed, walk into a ballroom on a dare and somehow capture the attention of the most sought-after man in London. Do you know what people said about me, Alina, once your little romance began? They stopped asking about my prospects entirely. They only wanted to know about you. Alina felt her chest tighten with a painful mixture of sympathy and anger. So you decided to destroy something good in my life because you were jealous of the attention I was receiving. I did not plan for it to go so far, Beatrice said, her voice breaking slightly. I only meant to slow things down, to give myself time to find my own match before the entire city forgot I existed. Lady Cassandra approached me weeks ago. She said she only wanted to delay the courtship, to give the Duke time to remember what he owed his family, his mother's wishes. She never told me she intended to end things between you completely. She only asked me to alter one letter, just one, to plant a small seed of doubt. And you agreed, Alina said quietly, the full weight of her sister's betrayal settling over her like a heavy blanket. Beatrice did not answer, though her silence was answer enough. Alina stood there for a long moment, staring at the sister she had known her entire life, searching for some trace of the girl who had once comforted her during thunderstorms, and finding only a stranger who had allowed her own jealousy to cause such lasting harm. I need you to tell the Duke the truth, Alina said finally. I need you to explain what you did and why. He deserves to know the letter he received was not mine. I cannot do that, Beatrice said, panic flickering across her face. If mother and father learn what I have done, if the entire city learns of it, I will never recover my reputation. I will never find a match of my own. Please, Alina, I am begging you, do not ask this of me. Alina felt torn between her own pain and a lingering, stubborn affection for the sister who had wronged her so deeply. But she could not allow the Duke to continue believing she had betrayed him with false words, not when the truth might yet repair what had been broken between them. I will give you a few days, Alina said finally. But if you will not tell him the truth yourself, I will find another way to make certain he learns it. Beatrice said nothing more, retreating from the room with tears in her eyes that Alina could not tell were born of guilt or simple self-pity. Alina remained standing in the quiet sitting room for a long while afterward, feeling more alone than she had in months, caught between the sister who had betrayed her and the man who no longer trusted her, with no easy path forward toward either forgiveness or repair. The days that followed proved among the loneliest of Alina's life. The Duke made no further attempts to call on her, and though she caught glimpses of him at various social gatherings, he kept his distance with a deliberate carefulness that felt far more painful than open anger would have been. Word of their cooling connection spread quickly through London society, and the whispers that had once celebrated Alina's unexpected rise now shifted into something crueler, speculating openly about what she must have done to drive away a man who had seemed, only weeks earlier, thoroughly devoted to her. Charlotte, to Alina's surprise, proved the one steady comfort during this difficult period. She sat with Alina in the evenings, offering quiet company without demanding explanations, and though Alina never told her the full truth of what Beatrice had done, she suspected Charlotte had guessed at least part of it, given the careful way she avoided mentioning their sister's name. I know things have been difficult, Charlotte said one evening, as they sat together near the fire. I know I have not always been the kindest sister to you, Alina. I let jealousy get the better of me more often than I care to admit. But I do not wish to see you hurt this way, not truly. Whatever has happened between you and the Duke, I hope you find a way to set it right. Alina studied her sister's face, searching for any sign of the resentment that had once colored so many of their interactions, and found instead something that looked genuinely like remorse. Thank you, Charlotte. That means more to me than you know. Margaret, meanwhile, had grown increasingly suspicious of Beatrice's behavior, noticing the same nervous energy Alina had observed, the secretive errands and averted glances that suggested a guilty conscience working itself into a frenzy. It was Margaret, in fact, who finally uncovered the piece of evidence that would change everything, a rough draft of the altered letter, still bearing Beatrice's handwriting in the margins where she had practiced copying Alina's script closely enough to fool an unsuspecting eye. Margaret found the paper tucked inside an old book in Beatrice's room while searching for a ribbon she had lent her sister weeks earlier, and she brought it directly to Alina without hesitation, her face pale with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "I could not believe it when I saw it," Margaret said, pressing the paper into Alina's hands. "I know we have had our disagreements as sisters, but I never imagined Beatrice would go so far. You must show this to the Duke, Alina. He deserves to know the truth, and you deserve to have your name cleared." Alina held the paper carefully, studying the practiced handwriting, the crossed-out words and revised phrases that told a clear story of deliberate deception. For the first time in days, she felt a small flicker of hope stirring beneath the heavy sadness that had settled over her since the charity function. She still did not know whether the Duke would believe her, whether the trust they had built together could be repaired after being so thoroughly shaken. But she finally had proof, undeniable proof, that the words he had read were never truly her own. The question now was whether he would be willing to hear the truth at all. Alina decided she would not send a letter this time. Letters, it seemed, could be intercepted, altered, twisted into something they were never meant to be. If she wanted the Duke to hear the truth, truly hear it, she would need to say it to him directly, with no paper standing between her honest words and his understanding. She learned, through a conversation overheard at her mother's weekly card game, that the Duke intended to attend a summer ball hosted by the Ashworth family the following evening, an event he had reportedly agreed to attend only reluctantly, at his mother's insistence. Alina spent that entire day preparing herself, not with elaborate gowns or careful curls, though her mother certainly saw to those details as well, but with a quiet determination to say what needed to be said, regardless of how the Duke might receive it. She arrived at the Ashworth ball with the folded paper Margaret had found tucked carefully into her reticule, her heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and resolve. The ballroom glittered with candlelight and the sound of a full orchestra, and Alina scanned the crowd until she finally spotted the Duke standing near a set of tall windows, looking as uncomfortable in the festive atmosphere as she had ever seen him, his mother standing beside him engaged in conversation with a cluster of other guests. Alina took a steadying breath and crossed the room, ignoring the whispers that followed her, whispers that had grown only more pointed in the days since her connection with the Duke had visibly cooled. She stopped a respectful distance away and waited until he noticed her, watching his expression shift from surprise to something more guarded as their eyes met. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I know you have no obligation to speak with me, but I am asking you please to give me 5 minutes. That is all I require." He hesitated, glancing briefly at his mother, who watched the exchange with an unreadable expression, before finally nodding and leading Alina toward a quieter corner of the room, away from the densest part of the crowd. "I received a letter from you," Alina began, before he could speak first, "explaining that you no longer wish to continue our acquaintance, because of words you believed I had written to you. I want you to know that I never wrote those words, Your Grace. I have proof of what truly happened if you are willing to look at it." She withdrew the folded paper from her reticule and held it out to him. He took it slowly, unfolding it with careful hands, and Alina watched his expression change as he studied the practiced handwriting, the crossed-out phrases, the clear evidence of someone attempting to imitate her own script closely enough to deceive him. "This is not your handwriting," he said slowly, though it was less a question than a realization forming in real time. "No," Alina said. "It belongs to my sister Beatrice. She altered my letter before it reached you, at the urging of someone who wished to see our connection fail. I do not say this to escape responsibility entirely, Your Grace. I trusted the wrong servant to carry a private letter, and that trust was misplaced. But I never wrote a single word suggesting I cared for your title more than I cared for you. Every word I have spoken to you, every hour we have spent together, has been entirely honest. The Duke stared at the paper for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes moving over the evidence again and again, as though searching for some detail that might contradict what he was seeing. When he finally looked up at Alina, his expression had softened into something raw and uncertain, an emotion she had not seen from him since the very first night they met. "Why would your sister do such a thing?" he asked quietly. "Jealousy," Alina said honestly. "And she was encouraged, I believe, by someone who wished to protect a match she considered her own by right. I will not pretend the reasons excuse what was done, but I wanted you to know the truth, whatever you choose to do with it." For a long moment, the Duke said nothing at all, and Alina braced herself for whatever response might come, prepared even for the possibility that the damage had already been done too thoroughly to repair. But then he folded the paper carefully and placed it in his coat pocket, and when he looked at her again, something in his eyes had cleared, as though a fog he had been living beneath for days had finally begun to lift. "I should have trusted you," he said. "When you told me the letter was not yours, I should have believed you immediately. Instead, I let old wounds convince me otherwise. I am sorry, Alina. I let fear win a battle it had no right to fight." "You had good reason to be cautious," Alina said gently. "You told me once that you had been deceived before, by someone you trusted completely. It is not unreasonable that such a wound would make trust difficult, even when the person before you has done nothing to earn your doubt." "Perhaps," the Duke said, "but you have done nothing but earn my trust. From the very first evening you sat beside me in that empty chair, and I allowed a moment of doubt to nearly cost me the one connection that has meant more to me than anything else in these past 3 years. Before Alina could respond, a commotion near the entrance of the ballroom drew the attention of nearly every guest in the room. Alina turned to see Beatrice standing near the doorway, her face pale, clearly having followed Alina to the ball uninvited, and beside her, looking equally uncomfortable, stood Lady Cassandra Fenwick, whose usually composed expression had cracked into something closer to panic as she realized the private scheme she had orchestrated was about to become very public indeed. Beatrice crossed the room slowly, her steps hesitant, until she stood before Alina and the Duke, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I could not let you carry this alone," she said, her voice shaking but audible to those nearby who had already begun to lean in with curious interest. "It was my doing, Your Grace. I altered my sister's letter. Lady Cassandra asked me to, and I agreed out of jealousy I am deeply ashamed of. Alina has done nothing wrong. She never has." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, and Alina watched as Lady Cassandra attempted to retreat quietly toward the edge of the room, only to find herself intercepted by the Dowager Duchess, who had crossed the ballroom with a speed and purpose that suggested she had heard every word of the confession. "Cassandra," the Dowager Duchess said, her voice cold enough to still the entire room, "I believe you and I need to have a conversation, and it will not be a pleasant one." Lady Cassandra's composure finally shattered entirely under the weight of the Dowager Duchess's stare, and she offered a stammering, incomplete apology before being led away by the older woman, leaving behind a ballroom full of guests who would certainly speak of nothing else for weeks to come. Beatrice remained standing before Alina, her tears now falling freely, careless of the many eyes watching her public confession. "I am so sorry," she whispered, "for all of it. I let my own unhappiness poison something that never should have concerned me at all. I do not expect you to forgive me tonight, or perhaps ever, but I could not let you continue carrying the blame for something I alone was responsible for." Alina felt a complicated tangle of emotions rising within her, anger and hurt still present but softened now by a sister's visible remorse, offered publicly and at genuine cost to her own reputation. "Thank you for telling the truth," Elinor said quietly. "It will take time before I fully trust you again, Beatrice, but I am grateful you found the courage to do this." Beatrice nodded, wiping at her tears, before retreating from the ballroom with as much dignity as she could manage under the weight of so many curious stares. Elinor watched her go, feeling the beginning of a long process of healing that would take far longer than a single evening to complete, before turning back to find the Duke watching her with an expression of quiet admiration. "You handled that with far more grace than I could have managed," he said. "She is still my sister," Elinor said simply. "Anger has its place, but it does not have to be the only thing I feel toward her." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and then, to the astonishment of everyone still watching the unfolding drama, he lowered himself onto one knee in the middle of the crowded ballroom, drawing gasps from every corner of the room. "I have spent 3 years believing that silence was safer than risking my heart again," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the now completely silent ballroom. "You walked across a crowded room on a foolish dare and reminded me what it felt like to laugh, to hope, to want something more than mere safety. I do not wish to spend another single day pretending that connection means nothing to me. Elinor Whitmore, will you marry me?" Elinor felt tears gathering in her own eyes as she looked down at the man who had once been called the most feared figure in London society, now kneeling before her with nothing but open and unguarded hope written across his face. She thought of the dare that had begun this entire journey, of the empty chair no one else had dared approach, of every honest conversation and quiet garden walk that had brought them to this exact moment. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with happiness. "Yes, I will marry you." The ballroom erupted into applause and excited chatter as the Duke rose to his feet and drew Elinor into an embrace, careless now of every watching eye, careless of every whisper that had once tried to tear them apart. Somewhere in the crowd, Elinor caught sight of Margaret clapping with tears of joy streaming down her face, and even Charlotte, standing near the edge of the room, offered a genuine and warm smile that held none of the old jealousy that had once colored her every expression. The wedding took place 3 months later, in a small chapel near Blackwood Hall, filled with family, friends, and the same society that had once whispered so cruelly about a girl who dared to sit beside a feared duke. Beatrice attended, having spent the intervening months working diligently to repair what trust she could with her sister, and though the relationship between them would never again be quite as simple as it once was, a fragile and honest peace had settled between them by the time Elinor walked down the aisle. As Elinor stood before the Duke exchanging vows that would bind their lives together, she thought back to the trembling girl who had crossed a crowded ballroom on nothing more than a dare, and a stubborn refusal to be called frightened. She had not known, in that moment, that she was walking toward the truest happiness of her entire life. She had only known that she was tired of being underestimated, tired of standing in shadows that were never truly her own. The feared Duke of Ashford Blackwood had reacted to that single act of quiet courage in a way no one in London had ever expected, and in doing so, had given Elinor Whitmore something far greater than the attention and admiration her sisters had once dared her to seek. He had given her a love built on nothing but honesty, patience, and the simple willingness to sit beside someone the rest of the world had been too afraid to approach.